So here's a little taster of what we're going to cover for you today.
As ever, we're going to have a quick look at the Russia-Ukraine war, the downing of an IL-76. What actually happened? Did Russia shoot it down? Did Ukraine shoot it down? And how's this war of words developing? We're going to have a quick look at the Israel conflict, more about the Red Sea, and where the hell is our British carrier? We've spent a fortune on those, yet we're not using them. Why are they both tied up in dock? We're going to look at the loss of 3 US servicemen to an attack in the north of Jordan. How has that loss of those 3 people led to rhetoric from former President Trump that talks about we're on the brink of World War III, just a result of that? And finally, we're going to look at Masters of the Air, which is a new sort of look at the Second World War bombing, the US part of the bombing campaign in the Second World War, and how that links very topically to events of today. It's going to be a busy podcast.
So buckle up. We hope you enjoy it. And if you do, then please follow us. So the US have a carrier fleet. It's led by the Eisenhower. It's busy. It's laden with weaponry. The Brits have got a couple of beautiful carriers. They're in dock. What's going on?
It's a bit of a tragic tale, actually. 2 of the biggest aircraft carriers that the Royal Navy has ever had in its inventory, HMS Queen Elizabeth and HMS Prince of Wales, which are phenomenally capable carriers, 72,000 tons. They are have the potential to be bristling with military capability, and yet the one time with the bombing missions against the Houthis, which the US are using their embarked aviation, bristling with F-18s, Tomahawk missiles being fired from the carriers. It's the ideal weapon to use in this sort of conflict, and yet what are the Brits doing? We are using Typhoons flying out of Cyprus on 3,000-mile plus round trips, plus air-to-air refueling, plus everything entailed, whilst these 2 ships are tied up in dock at the moment. I think part of the challenge, it's quite new. I mean, 2017, Queen Elizabeth first came into service, 2019 for Prince of Wales. And what we tend to forget is it's not just about the carrier. These carriers don't go to sea on their own. They go to sea with destroyers, other vessels to provide air defence for the fleet above water, and they also ships to look below water. They also go with a submarine, and they also go where they need a couple of fleet auxiliary vessels to provide wet support, so fuels and stuff like that, but also dry stores support.
So is it that the carriers aren't working, or they're short of something else?
Well, it's both. Interestingly, it's both. So the Prince of Wales came into service, and it turned out, I think one of the prop shafts for the propeller shafts is slightly misaligned, a matter of millimetres, but that's enough to mean it doesn't work properly. It needs to be fixed. But there's also, inevitably, with new pieces of equipment, there's some teething troubles. So they've been taking spares out of the Prince of Wales to put into Queen Elizabeth, which is not unusual with new kit, but it does mean you're doing what we call Christmas treeing the Prince of Wales. So that's not going to be able to set sail on operational duties anytime soon. But it's also, the trouble is the one vessel that the Royal Navy has to do these dry stores is the Royal Fleet Auxiliary Fort Victoria. And that vessel, the Royal Navy, like all 3 services, but particularly the Royal Navy, has got manning issues at the moment. So it's desperately short of personnel to take that thing to sea. And secondly, it's really old. It's not that reliable. And the replacements, 3 ships are meant to be replacing it, but they've got several years before they come into service. So frankly, first of all, there's just not they haven't invested in the full capability. The Defence has bought the 2 carriers, but hasn't invested across the suite to create the carrier capability. And the other issue is that, we have the at-sea deterrent and nuclear deterrent with our nuclear submarines. Now, to have a continuous at-sea deterrent, you need minimum of 4 submarines, which is why the Royal Navy has 4 submarines. And even with 4, sometimes with unserviceabilities, stuff like that, you struggle to keep one at sea all the time. If you want to have the carrier capability available 24/7, 365 days a year, you can't do it with just 2 carriers. And the danger, therefore, is it starts to look like,
a vanity project.
Well, yeah, you could say that, and we'll come on to that. But it's a bit like having a fire brigade that you're only going to commission for 6 months a year, and hope that that'll be the time when you have your fires.
Well, I mean, as a British taxpayer, I could take offence. I mean, I watch these carriers being built. I've been on them. I mean, I have to tell you, they are magnificent vessels. I mean, truly magnificent. But if I was a project manager and I'd built a product, and when it was launched, I had to tell the owner, actually, you can't use it because I forgot to get something else lined up, and I had plenty of time to do it, I think I'd have got my ass kicked.
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting topic, because as somebody who's flown jets off the carriers, the previous generation, Illustrious, Invincible and Ark Royal, I am a huge fan of the power projection capability, a little bit of our nation driving around, having influence around the world. It's incredibly powerful. But you can't do it half-cocked. You have to do it properly. And I think there's a couple of tragedies here, one of which is that we clearly haven't invested in the whole capability. We've been seduced by this whole idea of having the biggest ships we've ever had. And I know, because I worked in the Ministry of Defence during part of the time that this was all being delivered. And it would be fair to say that military, you never have enough money to do everything you want to do, so you have to prioritise. But ultimately, the people who make the decisions are the politicians. And it would be fair to say at the time that there was a political tailwind behind the carrier projects. Politically, a lot of sympathy. Now, at the time, call me a cynic, but at the time there was a Labour government in charge, and the 2 ships, when they were built in Gordon Brown's constituency. That created jobs and livelihoods for people. And the worry is that when you look at it through the lens of today, that actually we didn't create a whole through life capability cost, which we do in everything else. And we've ended up now with these huge potential of these carriers, huge potential. And yet there's been rumours about potentially selling off one of them. You know, they were talking about using them to plug gaps in American capability.
Got to rent them out.
Well, and they do have other roles. It's not just about projecting power, but from the start, this was always going to be a flagship project for the UK, demonstrating its ability to project power around the world, and it genuinely had huge potential. It's a real tragedy to see that the one time when it could have come of age, particularly with this Houthi thing, that instead they're both tied up at Portsmouth. It just feels wrong.
Well, I mean, nobody knows how long this conflict is going to last. So this is probably a question that we can't answer, but, will we ever see them in action in the Red Sea area and what's going on over there?
It looks unlikely, and the reason I say unlikely is because the process of literally throwing off the ropes and driving the ships to the Red Sea would take 10 days, 2 weeks, whatever. But that would be completely ignoring the fact that you have to have a whole load of crew on board that are worked up, that are ready to respond, because they're going to a war zone. They will come under attack, as HMS Diamond is coming under attack out there. So you'd want to have a crew that's right at the top of its game, ready. You need to make sure that ship is completely packed full of stores, ammunition, that the crew that are going on board are trained and ready to go. Now, for the US, their carrier fleet, when it deploys, it's ready. And it trains 24/7. So it's ready to go throughout its deployment. It's ready to go instantly to respond to something going on. Getting something that's at ground zero tied up alongside to actually having a fully trained, competent, capable military capability is a lot more than just sailing the vessel there. A lot more than that. So you'd be talking about months, not days, to get that carrier in place.
That all costs money as well. And don't answer the question, because I think we'll pick it up later. The question is, should Britain be spending more on its defence programme? So there's a massive row going on between Putin and Zelensky, apparently. a Russian plane with apparently 76 Ukrainian prisoners of war was on its way from Russia to Ukraine, purportedly for a prisoner swap, and it crashed. And in the fog of war, there's a big argument going on as to actually what happened. I mean, are we any closer to finding out the truth?
The short answer is no. Again, this is a really good example, I think, of where both sides are trying to use the information space to try to get advantage. It was a week ago today, as we film on a Wednesday, that the Russian IL-76, which is one of their transport aircraft, that was ferrying 65 prisoners of war, apparently, and 6 crew and 3 guards flying into Belgorod, which is the town that's very close to the Russian border with Ukraine. And it's worth remembering, Belgorod is a military logistics hub for the Russians. They routinely fly in missiles, ammunition, military supplies coordinated there before they go across the border into Ukraine. What we saw on the news was a big fireball coming up, and the story was that this aircraft had been lost, and then this flurry of the war of words started.
I mean, everybody's heard this. I mean, it was all over the place, trailed well as well. I felt the of the news pieces I watched, it seemed like they were coming down on the side of the Ukrainians actually shot it down by mistake. I mean, do you think that's fair based on what we know so far?
Well, I think you always have to put on the table what are the options and then take them off and see what you're left with here. It could have been an accident. But the IL-76, the Russian aircraft are traditionally, they're not very high-tech inside, but they're built strongly, robustly. And this was a 4-engine aircraft. It's really unlikely, it seems to me, that this was an accident. Whatever the competency of the crew or whatever, this was a catastrophic incident. So I think it's unlikely that it was an accident. Of the other 2 options that you consider, you go, well, one of them is that the Russians shot it down themselves. Now, you and I could laugh about that and say, yeah, that's never going to happen. But you've got to remember that there is a lot of air defense systems around the area. The predominantly young males who are controlling those are nervous. They don't get much time to make a decision because aircraft move pretty quickly generally. And whilst they shouldn't shoot down their own aircraft, you've got to remember that, I don't know what the weather was like that day. You often can't see the aeroplanes. You often can't hear them. And drone attacks are pretty regular across the border. So the Russian crews manning the surface-to-air missile systems, defences would have been nervous. And also, from my own experience out in the Gulf, when we were in the Gulf War, a lot of our crews were less nervous about flying across Iraqi airspace and getting shot down on their bombing missions than they were when they were coming home, coming towards the US Patriot system, which is incredibly capable, and it should be safe because it's your own missile system, but the same issue. You're coming back fast, you're coming back low, you're coming back very swiftly, and you're always nervous that people are going to shoot first
and
ask questions later.
Yeah.
So it's possible, unlikely. What looks the most likely, as you're suggesting, is that the Ukrainians shot it down.
I mean, if I put my conspiracy hat on for a second, and it's sort of within the realms of possibility, knowing some of the characters here. If you're going to do a prisoner exchange, then there's a lot of talking going on, a lot of planning, where you're taking off from, where you're landing, how many prisoners it's going to be. There's some sort of protocol so nobody makes mistakes, like, possibly this one has been made. Do you think it's remotely possible that Putin decided to deny some clarity? So it wasn't necessarily clear what was happening. And in other words, one of the mistakes that you've raised that could have happened was sort of deliberate. Is that ever possible at times like
I
this?
think it is definitely possible. When you look at it more objectively, what happened that day, it's entirely reasonable the Ukrainians would shoot at aeroplanes providing resupply into Belgorod. That's entirely reasonable. As you say, prisoner swaps generally, what the Ukrainians claim is that there was a prisoner swap arranged for that Wednesday. But they said every time they've done prisoner swaps before, the Russians have provided information about where the prisoners are flying into, where they're travelling, for exactly the reason you're suggesting, to avoid any risk that they will get targeted on the way in. And the Ukrainians would do exactly the same for the Russians. Now, the Ukrainians claim on this day, none of that information was provided. And yet, it appears that the flight containing those prisoners of war did, in fact, fly in. Now, again, we're not arrogant enough to say we know, but from a military perspective, it's pretty stupid to fly a military aircraft so close to a war zone into an airfield where you're used to providing military hardware that you know is going to be targeted when you're flying with prisoners of war. Because Putin may not care about the prisoners of war, but I think he had, 6 crew, 3 guards, Russian,
And a plane.
which he can ill afford to lose.
Yeah.
So it's a high stakes game of poker. If
He did it on. Yeah.
yeah,
Well, maybe. So here's my sort of result. I'd give the Ukrainian mistake 7 out of 10, and the Putin conspiracy theory 3 out of 10.
and I'd probably buy into that. And I think the very fact that also around this, the Ukrainians were not quick to respond when this happened. They weren't quick to deny it was them. And it's not unreasonable they would have targeted a military aircraft. The question was, as soon as they knew or think they knew that there were these prisoners of war, they'd have felt awful about the whole thing. And therefore, that's probably, as you suggest, it solves a couple of problems for Putin. But it's just a horrible example of what happens in this when there's a war going on, even where an exchange of prisoners, which should be relatively simple, potentially a lack of information flow, and then we end up asking all these questions, how you lose an aircraft, and prisoners who've had a difficult enough time were just on the verge of seeing their freedom again.
Going home.
Yeah.
Very sad.
Very tough.
3 US service personnel got killed a little while ago. A suicide drone apparently landed on their tent. A number of people were injured. 3 US personnel got killed. And this has given the US a problem because a lot of people in the US are baying for blood and want a swift response. And there's some challenges, isn't there, for Biden deciding actually what to do?
There is. It throws up all sorts of things. I mean, this was an outpost, I think it's called Tower 22, which is just on the border of Jordan and Syria, US base, which Jordan doesn't really admit to having bases there. It's all a bit sensitive. Jordan, after all, supports the Palestinians rather than, and of course, America is supporting the Israelis, which makes the relationship a bit difficult. But yes, on that fateful day, a drone got through, exploded whilst they were sleeping, 3 killed. So there's a couple of questions. First of all, tactically, how on earth did a drone get through? Drones are widespread. You can buy them available on the internet now. The war in Ukraine has shown how quickly they can be adapted. So they're an omnipresent threat. But let's be blunt, they're not that difficult to shoot down. And in the flatness of the desert, they're quite difficult to hide them when they come in. They don't go particularly fast. And there's lots of methods, that are available commercially, but also available secretly, that can take these things out. So how did one get through? Now, we're hearing rumours that part of that was because there was some confusion as to whether it was a friendly drone coming back or an enemy drone. I have to say,
easily done.
Well, you say that, but I think in the good old days when we were coming back home after war, missions, you'd have to come along a certain lane, flying a certain speed at a certain time. And because nobody else knew what that time and space was, they'd assume that you were friendly. But that was pretty dangerous to do. So now there are electronic means, IFF, identification of friend and foe, and other ways for identifying what's a friendly and what's not. How fast you fly, where you fly, the route you fly, stuff like that. So it's not just a matter of chance, it's a matter of technology as well. So it's really difficult to see. I suspect this is late at night, somebody's made a mistake here, and somehow a drone has got through. But as you said, the real issue here, I think, is it now puts Biden on the horns of a dilemma. Because there are some of those in Congress who are saying, you've got to
hit them hard.
Hit them really hard.
Yeah. It's if you just sort of stand back for a second, it's quite difficult for some pretty heavy emotional reasons. And I'm not discounting. I mean, as we said before, Sean, every life is a life. 100,000 lives is still a set of individual lives with a family and loved ones and a life to live. But you've got, I don't know, at least 25,000 civilians dead in Gaza, which is tragic. And we've got a big argument brewing in the US about 3 lives of combatants, or service personnel at least, in a conflict. It seems to be, I don't want to draw any equivalence, but it seems to be slightly imbalanced. This stuff is going to happen, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think it's always dangerous, isn't it? Because it starts to sound like equivalence. But I'm with you. I mean, it's particularly difficult because when you have former President Trump pointing the finger at Biden saying, this is your fault, you're taking us to the brink of World War III, is what he's been saying this week. You're going, whoa, hang on a minute. Exactly the point you're making, with 26,000 Palestinians dead, climbing by, hundreds each day, that it is absolutely tragic. And the US will undoubtedly respond in some way. But the danger is this is responding to a symptom. It's not the disease. The attacks on US servicemen have escalated tremendously since the 7th of October. What happened on the 7th of October? Hamas attacked Israel. And because Hamas is no match militarily for the Israeli Defense Force, what Israel is doing will eventually prevail over Hamas unless Iran uses other tools at its disposal to escalate the conflict. And that's why we're seeing the Houthis attack in the Red Sea. That's why we're seeing escalation of attacks against the US. So if the US suddenly attacks Iran because of attack on its service personnel, the danger is actually it's making a bad situation worse.
Well, yeah, and apparently Biden's trying to organise an extended ceasefire, 2 months, I think I heard, during which time all the hostages can be released. That negotiation requires everybody, as you said before, to leave their egos outside of the room and everybody to be calm. In the middle of that, you've got this thing which could easily escalate and uncalm everything and blow apart the chance to sort the hostage situation, which they desperately need sorting out.
But I think there's no coincidence here. It's no coincidence that Prime Minister Netanyahu's gone, no, I'm just going to get on until I've won. That's it. Now America's seen this is escalating. It's forced Americans' hand. America will do some sort of retaliation. But I don't think it's a coincidence that in almost the same breath, we're seeing a US-brokered potential deal being put in front of Hamas that, as we understand at the moment, is a 2-month pause in fighting, 100 hostages on the table, allows humanitarian aid to flow to try to, placate the humanitarian disaster that's happening in Gaza. And whilst I've no doubt Netanyahu would say, he'd go straight back to war at the end of that 2 months, if you have a 2-month pause, it'd be really difficult to get going again with all the aid situation going on. So I don't think it's coincidence. I think what the US is suddenly realizing from going from wholehearted support of Israel, vetoing the UN Security Council resolution that would have brought it to a halt, giving Netanyahu time to achieve his objectives, whatever they are, because it's not a 2-state solution. I think gradually this escalation is starting to get a bit out of control, and particularly when people like President Trump start talking about Third World War, that gets very scary.
So we've had Masters of the Universe, but this is Masters of the Air, which is a new US Apple docudrama, and it reveals the true nature of war. And war creates long, deep scars. And what I gather this docudrama is going to do, it's going to unveil all that. And it's a timely reminder of how brutal war is, Sean.
I think you're absolutely right, Bert, and that's why I certainly wanted to talk about it as part of our podcast, because I was very moved by Band of Brothers, which was the first of this series looking at realities of war, Easy Company for the liberation of France, following it through a series of chapters of their existence. And it was actually, what's most poignant is each of the series that was the prelude was a load of the veterans talking about their actual experience. And it was based on that you're watching it go on, and it shows the brutalities of war. Then they looked at the Pacific elements of the battles in 2010, but the air campaign was something that was clearly going to be quite expensive to do, and it's never been done till now. But luckily, Tom Hanks and Steven Spielberg, allegedly with a budget of about $200 to $250 million, they finally managed to produce this. And it's it's focused on the US. It's focused on a book that was written in 2007, B-17, Flying Fortresses in World War II, focused particularly on the 100 bomber group, which is known as the Bloody 100, largely because the dreadful losses they suffered. Sometimes, I think one of the stats was on one of the sorties, 12 of the 13 aircraft were shot down.
Really?
So it was just a brutal, but it, like all these, I suspect it's going to provide a unique insight into the brutality of war, the courage of the individuals involved, what they had to go through, the fear, the teamwork, the camaraderie, and certainly the little clips I've seen so far. I think it's going to prove to be a really good series.
I mean, you and I were at the unveiling the day, very hot summer's day, for the Bomber Command Memorial in Hyde Park. Is it going to contain any of the British role in those activities?
I very much doubt it, but I think if you rub off the American flag and take away the American accents, it'll be exactly the same as the experience of Bomber Command. When you and I were there, Bomber Command lost 55,500 service personnel from across a various number of nations that flew as part of it. And I think in principle, I think when you chatted to the veterans at the time, it was just amazing. They were scared of the enemy that are out there. They were scared of getting shot down by the anti-aircraft fire. They were scared of getting shot down by the night fighters that Germany were putting up. But actually, they're also scared about just hitting their own aircraft. We had 1,000 bomber raids going out, just trying to avoid getting hit by another aircraft as when it was hit, spiraling through the formation or whatever. But I was struck most by, on that fateful day when the Bomber Command Memorial was unveiled. I was there. It was one of my last days in the service. And I was in my blue uniform, medals, and it was a hot day, as you say. And I remember we spent a lot of the day handing out water, didn't we, to some of the veterans on the ground. Yeah. A lot of them were in their uniform. Every time you walked up to them, they'd see your medals and they'd see your wings, and they'd jump to their feet. 90-year-old old boys, stiffen themselves up. Within a minute, they'd be in tears.
They had a story to tell, didn't they?
Because they had a story to tell. They were sad that they felt guilty they'd survived when their colleagues had not. Because they knew your aircrew, they would talk to you about a story, an anecdote. Within a couple of minutes, it was evident they were feeling a bit wobbly on their feet, jet-lagged and whatever, so you walk away. And the family would come up to you and say, we've known him all our life and we've never heard that anecdote before. And it just made you realise how much of this stuff is locked away in those veterans' minds. There's not many of them left now, but it was such a huge privilege to be there on that day, and it was a chance to unveil a memorial. And I'd recommend anybody get the chance to go and visit the memorial. It's very poignant. For many years, this country felt a bit
guilty about it.
Yeah, because of the devastation wreaked on on cities. But I do a bit for charity with old veterans, and there was a 100-year-old who passed away sadly last year. But she talked about that period, and she said at the time Hitler was at our door. He was bombing London. He was shooting our airplanes down. He was about to invade. Anything we could do to take the fight to him was welcomed. And her view was, but we won. Why are we criticising? And I appreciate there's a whole nother series we can do on that. But I do think going back, that's why Masters of the Air, I think it's it's going to be a poignant reminder that we might glamorise war. For us, we'll talk about Gaza, we'll talk about the war in Ukraine, but we tend to talk about how do we get more weapons there? How do we get more, the politics of it? When you see the harsh brutality of what goes on, the price that's paid, the courage of the individuals concerned, the horrors of war, the brutality of it, I think these series, particularly when they're not melodramas, they are literally trying to give it an honest look, I think is a very poignant reminder of the dangers of the world we live in at the moment.
Sean, are we going to war?
No. I mean, the trouble is, it's a massive question, isn't it? And it's been brought into sharp focus by former President Trump, blaming President Biden for the escalations in the Middle East and the like, and this week threatening that we're on the brink of World War III. And although we get used to some of these inflammatory statements, I found it really odd that this past week I've been approached several times, particularly around the Sky campus where I spend a lot of time, people pulling me aside and genuinely asking me, are we going to war? Are we going to have to serve our country? So these flippant statements that get thrown around in the rhetoric of this year the presidential elections are happening, and of course in the UK as well. The US politics, they throw a lot of spears around at the time, but it is causing concern. And if you match that to the statements from the British Army, the head of the British Army, there's been a rotation coming up of heads of the British Army, and of course all three services take the opportunity at times to make the case for why they need more money. And the US and the British Army has turned around and said, we're too small. They've talked about having to start potentially conscription, all that sort of thing. That language has scared people in this country. And I think it's a really disturbing trend. And I think we'll get onto this we're going to use this as a bit of a theme, aren't we, in the future?
Yeah.
For me, I think I'm a pragmatist. We've only got so much money. We have the biggest overdraft in this country we've had in a generation. Interest rates have gone up. So we in this country have got to make choices.
So what worries me a bit is what you alluded to, which is the politics of it. War is a way to become famous. I doubt we'd have heard of Napoleon or Wellington. Maggie Thatcher, for instance, with the Falklands, and what was his name? The first Gulf War, Schwarzkopf. There we are. Now, how did I pull a name out of thin air? Because it was a war and a big one. So that worries me slightly, that you're sort of helpless to the politics.
I think that's always a risk. My own experience of being inside the Ministry of Defence is that there are some pretty robust conversations that go on in the Ministry of Defence before a nation goes to war. There is I'm not an academic, but Clausewitz, one of the masters of war, always said that the people, the politicians and the military, there's always a tension between the three, because the people want to be protected. The politicians essentially are self-serving, and the military are the ones that pay in blood for wars. And that's why you have military coups every now and again, because they no longer trust their political masters, because political masters just start exploiting the use of the military. Now, I'm not suggesting for 1 minute in this country we're going to have a military coup, but there is a very healthy dynamic between the military and the politicians behind closed doors that will be very robust about exploring every possible other avenue for resolving something before you end up unleashing the dogs of war. And I'm not saying that would ever stop an egotist from going off and find war. But also the other side of this, I mean, let's be blunt as well. Sometimes the military, if you're not being used, the danger is you don't get funded. So, for example, at the moment, the Royal Air Force is pretty busy. It's running white hot at the moment, and therefore it's in the news and it attracts more funding. Whereas the British Army, I'm talking about big handfuls now. We got involved. The last big war was the war in Afghanistan. We got a bit of a bruising there. And does our nation have the appetite for putting large bodies of people on the ground in harm's way again on another on foreign soil?
Well, are we equipped properly for a major war? Our defence budget, in terms of the size of the military force, is reduced. Are we in fit shape to handle one?
I think we are, but it depends on what type of scenario it is. And the harsh reality of history shows that we're never prepared for the war that actually happens. Do we have a very professional, very well equipped, very capable series of military capabilities in this country? Yes, we do. Should we be proud of them? Yes, we should. Does that mean we're ready for conducting World War III? No, that doesn't. Because defence is an insurance policy against an uncertain world. If you had to pay the premiums, have a full standing army, standing air force, standing navy ready for all eventualities, you consume the whole of our GDP. And yet in this country, we need an NHS. We need to have a welfare state. We need to have all these other things. You and I are both taxpayers. There is a limit to how much money you can spend. So I think there's two debates here, one of which is how much money gets into defence. In Margaret Thatcher's day, it was 4% of GDP. Now it's 2%. And the second issue is where you spend that money. Where are the priorities? We discussed earlier the carrier programme. It's easy to say with the benefit of hindsight, but we spent a lot of money in this country on something that we're not using the way it was designed to be used, and history will judge whether that was a wise way of spending a lot of money. And I think there are things that could be done to spend our money more wisely, particularly in the joint environment rather than individual services. It's still very much three stovepipes, yet you don't go to war like that. You go to war as a team.
Yeah, and as you say, you've got choices to make. We've got to run a country. All the services we provide peacetime, it's actually very expensive. And if you're not at peace, then you can funnel your money directly into your military program. I was doing some reading up on the Houthis the other day, and one of the questions I asked was, what is the size of their fighting force? Do you know what the answer was? It was at a minimum 25,000. At a maximum, it was 100,000. Now, our army is less than
80,000.
That's a lot of people in what we would have imagined was a ragbag bunch of thugs.
It is interesting, though. We could spend ages getting into this, and we're going to explore some of these later, aren't we, in different podcasts. But I would say that at the First World War and the Second World War, we were largely soldier-based, and we lost millions of people in those conflicts. And the lesson, I think, that we learned in the Western society was we never want to see those highly attritional battles again. So can you spend defence money in ways that allow you to win wars without paying such a huge price on the battlefield? And that's why we spent a lot of money on technology in jets, with fighter jets, with missiles, precision guided, with tanks, with anti-tank missiles, with the whole suite of capabilities that where you can wreak destruction at range rather than hand-to-hand fighting. I'm being, somewhat flippant for effect. A lot of capabilities like the Houthis they don't have a standing air force, standing army, standing navy. They don't have access to that sort of technology. So yes, the numbers look dramatic, but we've got to be careful not to assume that numbers translate to military capability.
Okay, sure. Well, maybe we pick this up in another podcast, because it would be interesting to look at what our allies have done in the last 20 odd years with their budgets, and therefore how ready they are for any sort of military-based conflict. And different, for instance, in Europe, different countries have handled it obviously differently. We were talking about Poland earlier. They pretty much doubled their defence budget, and with a growing economy as well. So as a percentage of GDP, it's getting to be a big number. They have sensed trouble on the horizon, and I think their 2023 budget for defence was 4% of GDP. That's a big number.
It is, which roughly what the US spends. But going back to your Houthi point, I think it'd be also interesting to explore that a bit more, because they may not have an established army, navy or air force, but they're causing havoc in the Red Sea, disrupting global trade. And despite the best efforts of a global superpower, in fact, the global superpower, hasn't stopped them.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, we were talking, weren't we, that one missile got through of the Houthis, and they reckon that put the price of bread up in America by 10 cents. America has a population of 330 million. Assume people have one loaf of bread a week. That's 330 million times 52. Divided by 10 for the 10 cents to turn it into dollars. You've got a lot of money. Billions on one product. Multiply that across the set of things people need on a day-to-day basis. That's a lot of money just taken out of the economy for one missile from a ragbag bunch of thugs.
One to explore.